The Appalachian bride of her brother, a secret marriage buried deep in the mountains. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is the documented reality of the Callahan family, whose bloodline became so intertwined that distinguishing uncle from brother, cousin from sister, became impossible in the isolated valleys of eastern Kentucky. The year was 1957. Eisenhower occupied the White House and America celebrated prosperity. Yet in the deepest folds of the Cumberland Mountains, some families lived as though the calendar had stopped a century before. The Callahan clan inhabited a region so remote that even the coal companies avoided it. A hollow accessed only by a treacherous dirt path that became impassable 6 months of the year. Thomas Callahan, born in 1923, was the patriarch of this isolated dynasty. His father had been his grandfather. His mother had been his aunt. For 3 generations, the Callahans had married within their own bloodline, creating a genetic bottleneck that would produce consequences science was only beginning to understand. The family compound consisted of 4 dilapidated structures arranged in a semicircle, their weathered wood the color of ash, their tin roofs corroded by decades of mountain rain. No electricity reached this hollow. No telephone lines. The nearest town, Hazard, Kentucky, lay 18 miles away through terrain that destroyed vehicles and tested even the most experienced drivers. In spring of 1957, Thomas Callahan's daughter Martha turned 16. She possessed the distinctive features that mark the Callahan lineage. Widely spaced eyes that gave her face an unsettling flatness, ears set unusually low on her skull, and fingers that curved inward at an abnormal angle. Her speech came slowly with difficulty, her tongue seemingly too large for her mouth. Yet by the standards of her family, Martha was considered normal, even fortunate. Her brother Daniel, 18 years old, displayed more severe manifestations. His jaw protruded forward dramatically, creating an underbite so pronounced that he could not chew solid food properly. His spine curved in a grotesque shape, forcing him to walk in a perpetual crouch. His left leg was 3 inches shorter than his right. But his mind, though slow, functioned well enough to work the family's small tobacco patch and tend their livestock. What outsiders would later discover was that Daniel and Martha were not simply brother and sister. Thomas Callahan had fathered them both with his own daughter Sarah, who had died during Martha's difficult birth. Sarah herself had been the product of Thomas and his sister Ruth. The family tree, when eventually reconstructed by investigators, resembled not a tree but a tangled vine, looping back upon itself in ways that violated both biology and law. On a humid June evening in 1957, as cicadas screamed their mating calls and fireflies pulsed in the gathering darkness, Thomas Callahan performed a ceremony in the largest of the 4 structures. He held a worn Bible, though he could barely read its words. Martha wore a dress stitched together from flour sacks, bleached as white as mountain water could make them. Daniel stood beside her, his twisted frame draped in his only suit. Purchased at a church charity sale in 1948. Thomas spoke words he remembered from a wedding he had attended in town decades earlier. There was no minister, no license, no witnesses beyond the family members who lived in the compound, Thomas's brother, Uncle James, who could not speak due to a malformed palate, and cousin Aunt Eleanor, whose milky white eyes saw nothing but shadows. Martha became Daniel's wife that night. She was 16 years old. He was her brother, her nephew, and her cousin, all simultaneously. The genetic coefficient of inbreeding between them was approximately 37.5%, far exceeding the threshold at which severe abnormalities become virtually certain in offspring. The mountains kept their secret. No one from town ventured into the Callahan Hollow. The family appeared in Hazard perhaps twice a year, always together, always silent, purchasing only essentials with cash earned from selling tobacco. Store owners remembered them as the strange ones from up the mountain, people to be served quickly and forgotten immediately. Through the summer and fall of 1957, Martha's body changed in ways that terrified her. She had no understanding of human reproduction beyond what the animals demonstrated. Her stomach swelled. She became sick every morning, vomiting until nothing remained but bile. Thomas told her this was God's blessing, though his eyes showed something else. Worry, perhaps, or resignation to a fate he had seen before. By winter, when snow sealed the hollow completely from the outside world, Martha's condition was unmistakable. The child growing inside her carried genetic material so duplicated, so dangerously concentrated, that nature itself would rebel against its creation. Daniel, despite his physical limitations, felt something he could not name when he looked at Martha. He had known her all his life as sister, but Thomas had told him she was now wife, that the Bible said a man should cleave unto his wife. Daniel's damaged mind could not fully process the contradiction, but his body responded to proximity and opportunity in the way bodies do. The cabin grew colder as January 1958 arrived. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. The family burned wood constantly, but heat escaped through 100 gaps in the walls. Martha, now 8 months along, moved with increasing difficulty. Her altered bone structure, the result of generations of inbreeding, created a pelvis too narrow for what was to come. Conferisse jr. inscrito nes canal, because the stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury. The genetic nightmares that reveal the darkest capabilities of human isolation. And once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it. February brought a blizzard that would be remembered in Kentucky for decades. Snow fell for 5 consecutive days, accumulating to depths of 4 feet in the valleys, 8 feet in the drifts. The Callahan Hollow became completely isolated, an island of suffering invisible to the world. Martha's labor began on February 12, 1958. She was 17 years old, delivering a child conceived with her brother in a union arranged by their father. The pain that seized her body was unlike anything the family had witnessed before. Her screams echoed off the frozen mountains, heard by no one but the 4 people trapped with her in that frigid cabin. Thomas Callahan had assisted at births before. He had delivered Martha herself 17 years earlier, watched his daughter's sister Sarah die from bleeding that would not stop. He had delivered 6 other babies in this hollow over the decades, though only 3 survived past their first year. But he had never seen labor like this. Martha's contractions came irregularly, violently, for 36 hours. Her narrow pelvis, deformed by genetic inheritance, could not accommodate the child trying to enter the world. In a hospital, physicians would have performed a cesarean section. In the Callahan Hollow, there was only Thomas, his shaking hands, and desperation. Daniel crouched in the corner, his deformed body rocking back and forth, making sounds like an injured animal. He could not comprehend what was happening to Martha, only that she was in agony and he was powerless. His limited cognition could not connect his actions months earlier to this moment of crisis. Eleanor, the blind cousinant, boiled water and tore cloth into strips, following instructions called out by Thomas. James, the mute uncle brother, held Martha's shoulders as she thrashed, his own strength failing as hours became a day, then longer. On the second night of labor, as Martha's screams weakened to moans and then to barely audible whimpers, Thomas made a decision. He took a knife used for butchering hogs, held it in the fire until the blade glowed red, and did what desperation demanded. The details of what followed are too graphic for full description, but the result was a child pulled from Martha's body in pieces, none of them moving, none of them drawing breath. The infant, a girl, displayed abnormalities so severe that Thomas later told investigators he did not know if it had ever been truly alive. Her skull was misshapen, collapsing inward at the temples. Her face possessed features only partially formed, as though creation had begun and then abandoned the effort. Her limbs were present but fused at odd angles. The genetic concentration, the result of brother mating with sister, already herself a product of severe inbreeding, had produced something that defied viability. Martha survived, though the trauma would leave her unable to bear more children. For 3 days she lay in fever, her body fighting infection without antibiotics, without medical care, with only mountain remedies of herbs and prayers. She emerged from the crisis permanently altered, moving through the cabin like a ghost, speaking rarely, eating less. The frozen ground prevented burial. Thomas wrapped the malformed infant in cloth and placed it in a wooden box, which he set outside in the snow, letting winter preserve it until spring permitted interment. The family never spoke of that night again, at least not to each other. Silence became their shared language of trauma. March arrived, and with the thaw came a visitor. Reverend Samuel Morton, a Baptist minister from Hazard who made annual trips to check on isolated families in the mountains, managed to navigate the muddy path into Callahan Hollow. What he found shocked him into immediate action. Reverend Morton observed Martha's condition, her pale complexion, her vacant stare. He noticed the way Daniel stayed close to her, the way Thomas watched them both with eyes that held too many secrets. He saw the wooden box still outside, its contents revealed by melting snow. The Reverend asked questions. Thomas provided answers that made no sense, that contradicted each other, that eventually revealed the terrible truth. Martha was Daniel's wife. Martha was Daniel's sister. The child had been both their daughter and their niece. The family tree was a circle. Reverend Morton left the hollow, promising to return with help. He contacted the sheriff of Perry County, a man named Harold Sykes, who had heard rumors of the Callahans but never investigated. Together they contacted the state health department. By April 1958, a social worker named Margaret Hayes made the difficult journey into the mountains. What Margaret Hayes documented in her report would eventually reach national attention. She described living conditions that belonged to a previous century: no sanitation beyond an outhouse, no clean water source, no adequate food storage. She described family members whose physical deformities clearly indicated generations of inbreeding. She described Martha, barely 17, recovering from a birth that nearly killed her, married to her brother by their father. But most disturbing, Margaret Hayes documented the burial site. When ground thawed enough to permit excavation, authorities discovered not one infant body but 6, buried in crude graves around the property, some dating back years. Each represented a failed attempt by the Callahan bloodline to reproduce itself. Each a child born of incestuous unions, each too genetically compromised to survive. The authorities who descended upon Callahan Hollow in May 1958 encountered a situation without precedent in Kentucky legal history. How does one prosecute a family whose crimes are against biology itself? How does one explain to people with limited education and no exposure to genetics that their way of life was creating monsters? District Attorney Robert Fleming faced a dilemma. Thomas Callahan had clearly arranged the marriage between Daniel and Martha, knowing they were siblings. But in 1958, genetic testing as we know it did not exist. Blood typing could establish parentage in some cases, but the tangled relationships in the Callahan family defied simple analysis. Fleming relied instead on testimony and physical evidence. He brought in Dr. William Ashford, a physician from the University of Kentucky who had studied genetic disorders. Dr. Ashford examined each family member, documenting the physical manifestations that clearly indicated severe inbreeding, the characteristic facial features, the bone deformities, the cognitive impairments. Dr. Ashford's testimony before the grand jury in June 1958 provided the scientific foundation for prosecution. He explained how recessive genes, normally masked in diverse populations, become expressed when close relatives reproduce. He showed photographs of the Callahan family members, pointing out features that appeared consistently across generations: the protruding jaws, the widely spaced eyes, the curved spines. But the most damning evidence was Martha herself. At 17, she appeared decades older, her body ravaged by the birth, her mind retreating into silence. When asked questions, she responded in monosyllables or not at all. Psychologist Dr. Elena Rodriguez evaluated her and testified that Martha functioned at approximately a 9-year-old level, making informed consent impossible. Thomas Callahan was arrested in July 1958 and charged with multiple counts, arranging an illegal marriage between siblings, contributing to the delinquency of minors, and unlawful burial of human remains. Daniel, due to his severe cognitive impairment, was deemed incompetent to stand trial. Martha was placed in state custody, becoming a ward of Kentucky. The trial began in September 1958 in the Perry County Courthouse in Hazard. The small courtroom overflowed with spectators, many traveling from neighboring counties to witness proceedings that newspapers were calling the most disturbing case in Appalachian history. Thomas Callahan's defense attorney, a local lawyer named Gerald Hopkins appointed by the court, argued that his client was simply following family tradition, that isolated mountain people should not be judged by standards they never learned. It was a weak defense, and Hopkins knew it, but he could offer nothing else. The prosecution presented evidence methodically. They showed photographs of the burial sites. They presented testimony from Reverend Morton, from Margaret Hayes, from Dr. Ashford. They brought Martha into the courtroom, and her presence alone, fragile, damaged, clearly a victim, sealed Thomas's fate. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Thomas Callahan guilty on all counts. Judge Harrison Blackwell sentenced him to 15 years in the state penitentiary, the maximum allowed under the charges. Now I want you to do something. Think about Martha, 17 years old, her childhood stolen, her body broken, her baby buried in frozen ground. Leave a comment with just these words: Martha deserved better. Let her story be remembered. Let her name be spoken. But the legal resolution did not address the larger question: what happens to a family bred into genetic disaster? The state of Kentucky faced the task of rehabilitating people whose very DNA had been corrupted by generations of isolation and inbreeding. Daniel was institutionalized at the Kentucky State Hospital in Danville, placed in a ward for patients with severe developmental disabilities. He would spend the rest of his life there, dying in 1979 at age 41 from complications related to his spinal deformity. Martha remained in state custody, placed initially in a group home in Lexington. Social workers attempted to educate her to help her develop skills for independent living, but the damage was too profound. She never learned to read beyond a first-grade level. She never held employment. She never spoke about her time in the Hollow, maintaining a silence that psychologists believed was protective, her mind's way of surviving trauma. James and Eleanor, the other family members found in the Hollow, were also removed and institutionalized. James died within a year, his body unable to adapt to life outside the mountains. Eleanor lived until 1965, her blind eyes finally closing in a state facility she never understood. The Callahan property was seized by the state and burned to the ground in 1959. Officials believed it was a health hazard. But the real reason was simpler. They wanted to erase evidence of what had happened there. To bury the shame of a family that revealed the darkest possibilities of human isolation. The Callahan case arrived at a pivotal moment in genetic science. In 1958, researchers were still mapping the basic mechanisms of heredity. The structure of DNA had been described by Watson and Crick only 5 years earlier. The understanding of how genetic disorders propagate through populations was primitive compared to modern knowledge. Dr. William Ashford, the physician who testified at Thomas Callahan's trial, recognized the scientific opportunity presented by the family. With permission from the state, he collected medical records, photographs, and physical measurements from all surviving family members. His goal was to document in unprecedented detail the effects of extreme inbreeding on human beings. Ashford's research, published in 1961 in the Journal of Genetic Medicine, became a landmark study. Titled Genetic Consequences of Sustained Consanguinity, The Callahan Family of Kentucky, it provided quantitative analysis of inbreeding depression in humans. Ashford calculated that the coefficient of inbreeding in the Callahan family reached levels typically seen only in laboratory experiments with animals. And the study documented specific disorders that appeared across generations: mandibular prognathism, where the lower jaw extends far beyond the upper; syndactyly, the fusion of fingers and toes; kyphoscoliosis, severe curvature of the spine; microcephaly, abnormally small skull size; and cognitive impairment ranging from mild learning difficulties to profound intellectual disability. Most disturbing, Ashford's research revealed the infant mortality rate in the Callahan family. Approximately 70% of children born died before age 5, most within days of birth. The 6 buried infants authorities discovered likely represented only a fraction of failed pregnancies over the decades. The Callahan case became a teaching example in medical schools across America. Genetic counselors used it to explain to patients why close relative reproduction carries such catastrophic risks. Anthropologists studied it to understand how isolated populations can inadvertently destroy themselves through endogamy. But beyond science, the case sparked broader social questions. How many other families like the Callahans existed in America's remote regions? How many hollows, valleys, and isolated communities harbored similar secrets? The answers were disturbing. Between 1958 and 1965, social workers in Appalachia identified at least 17 other families practicing sustained consanguinity. None reached the extreme levels of the Callahans, but all showed evidence of genetic damage, increased rates of stillbirth, higher infant mortality, elevated incidence of rare recessive disorders. The state of Kentucky responded with outreach programs, sending nurses and educators into remote areas to explain basic genetics, to encourage exogamy, to break the cycle of isolation that enabled such practices. The programs met resistance. Mountain families, suspicious of government intrusion, often refused cooperation. One social worker, Janet Perkins, who worked in eastern Kentucky from 1959 to 1964, later wrote about her experiences. She described families where children born healthy were exceptions rather than the rule. She documented communities where genetic disorders were so common that they seemed normal to residents. She encountered families who genuinely did not understand why their children kept dying, kept being born with terrible deformities, kept failing to thrive. Perkins also documented the economic factors that contributed to such isolation. These were families living in extreme poverty, in regions with no industry beyond dying coal mines, no opportunity for young people to leave and find partners elsewhere. They married within their families not purely from choice, but from lack of alternatives, from geographic isolation that made any other option virtually impossible. The Callahan case forced America to confront an uncomfortable reality, that within its borders, in the modern 20th century, there existed pockets of medieval-level isolation where biology was reverting to something prehistoric, where the gene pool had become so small that catastrophe was inevitable. Martha Callahan spent 23 years in state custody, moving between group homes and supervised living facilities. Records from her caseworkers paint a picture of a woman permanently broken by her early experiences, never able to fully integrate into normal society. In 1965, when Martha turned 24, social workers attempted to transition her to independent living in a small apartment in Louisville. The experiment lasted 6 weeks. Martha could not manage basic tasks, paying bills, shopping for groceries, maintaining cleanliness. She spent most of her time sitting by the window, staring out at nothing, speaking to no one. She was returned to supervised care, this time in a long-term facility called Meadowbrook House, which specialized in adults with developmental disabilities. There, Martha found something resembling stability. She worked in the facility's laundry room, a simple job she could manage. She ate meals in the common dining room, always alone, never joining the social activities other residents enjoyed. Staff members who worked with Martha during these years remembered her as profoundly sad, as though sorrow had become her natural state. She never smiled. She never showed anger. She existed in an emotional flatline. Numbed by trauma her limited cognition could process but never overcome. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the psychologist who had evaluated Martha during the trial, continued to see her periodically throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Rodriguez's notes document Martha's deteriorating mental state. By 1970, Martha had essentially stopped speaking altogether. By 1975, she showed signs of early-onset dementia, her damaged brain aging prematurely. In 1981, at age 40, Martha Callahan died in Meadowbrook House. The cause of death listed on her certificate was pneumonia, but the reality was more complex. Her body, weakened by the genetic burden she carried, by the trauma of the birth that nearly killed her at 17, simply gave up. She was buried in a state cemetery outside Louisville, her grave marked by a simple stone bearing her name and dates. No family attended the funeral. Thomas Callahan had died in prison in 1973. Daniel had died in the state hospital in 1979. The other family members were gone. Martha died alone, as she had lived since being removed from the hollow. But Martha's story did not end with her death. In the decades since, the Callahan case has been studied, analyzed, and referenced in hundreds of academic papers. It appears in genetics textbooks as a cautionary tale. It is taught in medical schools as an example of what can happen when biology is pushed to its limits. In 1995, a documentary filmmaker named Thomas Green attempted to create a film about the Callahan family. He interviewed surviving social workers, obtained historical records, and visited the site where the hollow had existed. Nothing remained but overgrown forest, nature reclaiming what had briefly been human habitation. Green's documentary, Ghosts of the Hollow, aired on PBS in 1996. It reached millions of viewers, bringing Martha's story to a national audience. Some viewers expressed revulsion. Others showed compassion. Many struggled to comprehend how such a situation could occur in modern America. The documentary sparked renewed interest in the issue of genetic isolation. Researchers began studying other communities, not just in Appalachia, but worldwide, where geographic or cultural isolation had created similar genetic bottlenecks. The Callahan case became a reference point, an extreme example that illustrated broader principles. In 2003, genetic researchers from Johns Hopkins University obtained permission to conduct DNA analysis on stored blood samples from the Callahan family members. The analysis, impossible in 1958, confirmed what had been suspected. The coefficient of inbreeding in the family was approximately 35%, comparable to mating between parent and child, repeated across generations. The researchers also identified specific genetic markers associated with the disorders observed in the family. They found mutations in genes controlling bone growth, facial development, and neurological function. Some of these mutations were so rare that they had never been documented before, suggesting they arose within the Callahan lineage itself, products of genetic isolation taken to its extreme. Today, the Callahan case remains a touchstone in discussions about genetics, ethics, and human rights. It raises questions that have no easy answers. How do we balance individual freedom with biological reality? How do we intervene in isolated communities without destroying their culture? How do we prevent genetic disasters without imposing eugenic policies? Martha Callahan never answered these questions. She never spoke publicly about her experiences. She carried her trauma silently until it killed her. But her existence, her suffering, and her story demand that we ask these questions, that we confront the darkest possibilities of human isolation. The hollow where the Callahans lived has been gone for over 60 years. The family bloodline ended with Martha's death, the genetic nightmare finally extinguished. But the lessons remain, written into academic papers, taught in classrooms, discussed in medical conferences. Martha was a victim not just of her father's decisions, not just of geographic isolation, but of biology itself, of what happens when the human gene pool becomes too small, too concentrated, too inbred to sustain life. Her baby, born malformed and stillborn, represented the ultimate failure of consanguinity, the point at which nature itself rebels against reproduction. The Appalachian bride of her brother, a secret marriage buried deep in the mountains. This was Martha's reality. This was her nightmare. This was the price of isolation, of tradition taken to its horrifying extreme, of biology pushed beyond its breaking point. If you've watched until the end, you've seen the full horror of what genetic isolation can create. Confira sege inscrito nes canal, because we don't shy away from the darkest chapters of human history. We bring you the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about isolation, genetics, and the consequences of keeping bloodlines too pure. Subscribe now and face the reality that history tried to bury. Se voca assistiu 8 aki, porc gastu dessa historia dux commentario dizendo, eu assisti 8 aki. Para que eu passate conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das histórias aqui do canal. If this story impacted you, hit that like button. If you believe these hidden histories need to be told, share this video. Martha's story deserves to be remembered not as entertainment, but as a warning about what happens when isolation and biology collide in the most catastrophic way possible. The Callahan family is gone, but the lessons remain, and we will continue uncovering them one buried secret at a time.